Hello and welcome back to Jaspreet Travels. In this travel vlog, come spend 5 days with me on my first ever visit to India, where I visit Delhi and Jaipur. But first, let's back up. If you don't know me, my name is Jaspreet and I enjoy all things related to travel and commercial aviation. As someone who identifies as Indo-Fijian, I've always wanted to visit India, but have been intimidated to do so, as I don't really speak Hindi well and I don't really have family there. However, an opportunity came up as I needed to do a last-minute mileage run to re-qualify for status, so rather than doing a bunch of domestic turns, I found a business class fare sale returning from India that fit exactly what I needed. I originally was going to spend 2 days in London and 2 days in India to make this just a very short trip to India, with a plan to return longer later. However, on my way to London, I noticed some inventory open up for Saver Award space on British Airways, and I was able to book a trip for 20,000 miles that gave me an extra 3 days in India. So get ready to come along with me, and don't forget to stick around until the very end for some travel tips for those visiting India for the first time. This journey started off with a United Airlines Boeing 767 flight from Chicago O'Hare into London Heathrow, where I had about a 10-hour layover and was able to take the brand new Elizabeth line over to Terminal 4 to transfer to the Hilton, where I got a day rate and was able to relax for a little bit, before eventually making my way over to Terminal 5, where I realized I need to learn how to double the amount of time that I give to myself to show up to places, especially airports. Made my way to the gate where they were in the final boarding group for this brand new A350 with non-stop service over to Delhi, India. Made my way to my seat, settled in, relaxed, played with the entertainment system for a little bit and got my movies queued up for the flight, and eventually we were on our way to India. The flight passed by fairly quickly and soon we were on our way into Delhi, where we actually had to do a little bit of a holding pattern due to some fog in the area, and the aircraft did a special auto-land procedure according to announcements by the crew, which was fairly interesting to hear about. Once arriving in India, it was time to head through customs and immigration, where I was able to present my printed copy of the visa that I got approved a couple days before the flight, as well as interacted with several customs agents and officers, and encountered some very much contradictory signage, instructions, and just general chaos all over the place, but eventually was able to make it through immigration, where I then spent some time looking for an ATM at the airport, and surprisingly, it was very hard to find one that would take a US Bank of America debit card, but after trying a few, I was able to withdraw some cash, and then went over to an Uber station and followed this dog, who was very adorable, to catch an Uber over to my hotel. For this trip, I was staying at the Le Méridien near Connaught Place, which was in the heart of the city and pretty centrally located. The staff was very friendly and the rate was very affordable, and I was able to get it for about $110 US per night. With my gold status with Marriott Bonvoy, the staff upgraded my room, and it was a fairly clean room with lots of space, lots of amenities, and bottles of water, and a little tablet that controlled all of the lighting in the room. This is the view that I had looking out towards the President's Palace on a very smoggy day, and overall I really enjoyed the room. The staff was very friendly, the bathroom was very nice and clean, and it was a great property to stay in. After a quick shower and a short nap, it was time to go out and about and explore the city on my first day in India. I decided to take it easy and made a quick adventure out to Connaught Place to visit a restaurant named Quality, which is one of the oldest restaurants in Delhi that was founded during the colonial times. It had a fairly interesting atmosphere with some live music, as well as like an older colonial style interior, and I was able to enjoy a really spicy paneer dish as well as a mint lemonade type drink, and had a really great time. I wanted to try out more, but I was still fairly tired from the flight and recovering from the red eye. After enjoying my meal, it was time to explore and do a little bit of shopping. After negotiating pricing on both rickshaws and at various markets throughout the city, it became clear to me how obvious of an ABCD that I am. I was easily clocked as an American tourist, and for a 1-mile rickshaw ride, I was quoted a price of 5,000 Indian rupees. After some haggling, I was able to bring this down to the price of about 1500 Indian rupees. However, when checking the Uber app later, I noticed that if I would have just done this ride on Uber, the price would have been less than 50 rupees. My suggestion is to use apps like Uber and Ola when trying to navigate India if possible, and if needing to get to an area that may not have either of those apps, getting a fixed price beforehand and making sure that the driver is able to stick to it. It also appeared obvious that I was a tourist after making some attempts to cross the street, which is a very unique experience here as there aren't many crosswalks and cars just don't stop. The trick is you just have to hold out your hand and just go. After getting settled in on my first day, I wanted to go out and explore the city, so I booked a tour with Viator with Pioneer Holidays to go see a handful of the sites around Delhi and Old Delhi. After being picked up from my hotel in the morning, it was time to set out and explore the city. We first headed to Old Delhi, where we caught a bike rickshaw to our first stop at the Jama Mosque. Built by Mughal emperors in the 16th century, it served as an important site and also an important site during the colonial era. It can also be seen featured in the popular TV show Made in Heaven as in the background near the office setting from that show. The architecture was beautiful. I especially loved the entryways, views of the Red Fort and Old Delhi markets, traditional archways, and the beautiful prayer hall and courtyard. After spending some time exploring the mosque, it was time to get back on the rickshaw and head out towards the famous Chutney Chowk market. Filled with endless rows of streets lined with shops, there is basically a street for everything here. Clothes, watches, food, and jewelry, the streets are often very busy and always bustling. This is the famous street filled with pretty much anything you could want for an Indian wedding. The colors, jewelry, and clothing were all very mesmerizing. We eventually made our way over to Kari Baoli, the largest spice market in all of Asia. It is over 400 years old, and you can buy everything you can imagine from teas, flowers, nuts, and almost any type of spice that you'd want. Many of the shops have been run by the same families for over 10 generations. The smells in this area were very strong with a lot of very aromatic spices. After a little bit more time exploring the market and the streets of Old Delhi, we made our way towards the next destinations, taking in the sights, sounds, and traffic of Delhi. At one point on the main road to get to the next destination, the gridlock was so bad that people were getting out of their cars and walking, which is what myself and my guide ended up doing. We made it to the destination in about 10 minutes of walking versus what would have been an hour of waiting in the car, and ironically enough, I felt more confident in walking in this gridlock than I did crossing a street. And soon enough, we were at Humayun's tomb. Built in the 15th century, this was the building that inspired the design for the Taj Mahal. This is one of the few monuments built by a wife for her husband, Humayun, the second Mughal emperor of India, and it took 8 years to build, made out of a material of warm sandstone, which is what gives it its iconic red hue. This was one of the first Persian architectural style buildings to feature a double dome, as well as a large garden surrounding the tomb. The Isa Khan tomb is older than Humayun's tomb, and it's dedicated to the first Afghan noble who fought against the Mughals. And there's also a tomb dedicated to the royal barber who served the Emperor Humayun. Finally, it was time for lunch at Connaught Clubhouse and Microbrewery. I tried a really flavorful paneer with a creamy black dal, along with some of the flakiest, almost croissant-like naan that I've had. It was then time to hit the road again. We drove by the famous India Gate monument dedicated to the 70,000 Indian soldiers who lost their lives in World War I. Soon we were off on the next stop of the tour, a historic stepwell believed to be built by King Agarsen in the 14th century. And for the final stop of the tour, we visited the site that was Gandhi's final home and also where he was assassinated. There were lots of artifacts from his life, and tracing his final footsteps to where he was assassinated offered moments of meaningful reflection. Finally, I was dropped back off at my hotel where I was able to relax for the evening. Overall, I had a really great time on this tour and would highly recommend it. Asim and Ankur were very professional and knowledgeable and made it very easy to see the big sights of Delhi without having to do much effort. I've included a link to the tour below in the description if you'd like to check it out for yourself. It was eventually time to head out to dinner. I had a few spots that I really wanted to try, but it was Christmas Eve and a busy Sunday evening, so getting a reservation or seating at these places was pretty difficult. Eventually, I ended up at McDonald's, but no complaints here, as they had a fantastic vegetarian selection with some flavorful and spicy aloo tikki potato burgers and paneer wraps. If only these could find their way to the States. I decided to bake in a free day for some solo exploring, mostly visiting markets and temples. I started off the day by trying to visit the Lotus Temple, but it was a Monday, so it was closed. I then visited the nearby Kali Ma Temple and explored the markets and stalls nearby after. I soon headed back towards Connaught Place, where I then visited the Hanuman Temple and the Ganesh Temple, both really beautiful and meaningful sights. The monkeys around the temple were also pretty hilarious to watch. Some of them tried to do funny activities, like this one putting on a shirt and taking it off, as well as I saw one that was just eating various bananas, and one that also had an ice cream cone that it was very much enjoying. After finishing up at the temples, I then decided to just walk around the area for a little bit to enjoy the sights, sounds, and smells of Connaught Place. For dinner, I then went to Dosa Prakash, a really famous dosa restaurant in the area, where I got some light and crispy dosas that were some of the best that I've ever had. I also had a really flavorful paneer kathi roll that was just packed full of spices and flavor. However, I also got a Manchurian dish that unfortunately wasn't the best that I've ever had, so I wouldn't recommend getting that dish at that restaurant, but everything else was fairly good. I then headed back to my hotel and called it an early night, as I was going to be doing a very special trip next day. The next morning, I woke up at 3 a.m. to get ready to head to the airport to visit a part of India that I've always wanted to go to, Jaipur, Rajasthan, the region of India that my family originated from before going to Fiji. While I eventually wanted to spend several weeks exploring the region, this trip only allowed for a day, so I took what I could get. I showed up to the airport over an hour before my flight, and the terminal was fairly nice and new. Getting through security took a while, as every agent seemed to have their own rules, and terminal Wi-Fi was a bit hard to access, as you needed to scan a passport in a kiosk if you don't have an Indian phone number, and that kiosk was down during my visit. I booked my outbound ticket on Indigo Airways and had a fairly pleasant flight. Indigo ran a really efficient operation, and one of the things I noticed is that my boarding pass or gate screen didn't indicate the boarding time, only the departure time. I showed up to my gate about 30 minutes before departure, and the whole plane had pretty much already boarded. My fare class included some snacks which were handed out right after boarding, and soon we were on our way. The flight was blocked at about an hour, however the actual flight time felt like only about 30 minutes or so. As soon as we reached our cruising altitude, only getting up to about 18,000 feet, it was time to begin our descent and make our way into Jaipur. and soon we were on the ground in Jaipur. I was originally going to book a private tour to explore the city. However, one of my close friends and former coworkers lives in the area and offered to show me around for the day. He has an excellent travel social media profile and seems to travel more often than I do, so go give him a follow and enjoy his content. Our first stop for the day was near the airport at Patrika Gate, a famous hand-painted monument that depicts the culture of Rajasthan through nods to temples, forts, palaces, and rulers of the region on various columns and archways. Our next stop was to grab a traditional Rajasthani breakfast item, pyaz ki kachori, a fried pastry filled with a spicy onion filling. This was my first time having this dish, and it was definitely a highlight of the trip, and something that I've been unable to find replicated in the US. We also tried the dessert version as well, which was very flavorful and coated in a sweet syrup. It was then time to head out and see more sights in the Pink City, which became the city's nickname after a king in the 18th century had most buildings painted pink, the color of hospitality, in order to prepare for a visit by Queen Victoria. We then arrived at one of Jaipur's most famous sites, the Hawa Mahal, or Palace of the Winds. The palace was built in the 17th century to allow royal women to observe everyday life and festivals below, with a design that creates a special cooling effect to ease high temperatures in the summer. We were then back on the streets of Jaipur and didn't spend much time exploring before heading off to the next destination, the famous Jal Mahal, or Water Palace. This was designed in a traditional Rajput style of architecture and used as a vacation lodge for the royal family during hunting trips. Back on the road again, we headed to one of the most famous forts in the area, Amir Fort, or the Amber Fort. Built out of sandstone and marble in the 15th century, the 4-story fort has an impressive courtyard, a special Sheesh Mahal or mirror palace, and many other impressive areas used by rulers over the centuries. You may recognize this fort from a lot of classic Bollywood movies. After spending some time exploring the fort, we then drove past some jewelry shops in the area and some of the local markets before stopping to grab a traditional thali dish for dinner at Thali House. The curry and vegetables were another highlight of this trip food-wise, filled with a lot of flavor and spice, and I hope to make it back here again. My final visit of this trip to kill some time before heading back to the airport was the World Trade Park Mall, which was really interesting and neat, filled with a lot of restaurants, stores, and experiences. Made my way back to the Jaipur airport, where security seemed to also have very different processes compared to Delhi, and boarded my first ever flight on SpiceJet, and actually my first ever flight on the Dash 8 aircraft. Short flight, but my fare class also entitled me to some food, which was a fairly interesting sandwich. However, as soon as I opened it up, the passenger next to me accidentally knocked it off the tray table, so I didn't really get to enjoy more than a bite of the sandwich, but it was still fairly good. However, the flight was fairly short, and soon we were making our way down into a foggy Delhi. Having read about Indian aviation for a while, it was fairly interesting to experience it firsthand, and overall, I really enjoyed both of my flights on SpiceJet and Indigo and hope to try them again in the future. For my final day in India, I left my schedule fairly open. I slept in after a long day in Jaipur the day before, but when I was finally ready to go out, I met up with the cousin of one of my close friends back home in Chicago for lunch. We chatted aviation for a bit, and I got to enjoy chole bhature and other Indian street food at Haldiram's. It was a little bit of a chaotic environment, but a really good spot to try out street food in a restaurant setting. After walking around for a bit, I was in the mood for kulfi, but couldn't find anywhere nearby that would sell it on its own without a sit-down restaurant type of environment, so I settled on an ice cream store recommended by several locals. I went into Naturals Ice Cream and was able to enjoy a Malai, mango, and orange pistachio ice cream. I then spent a few more hours walking around the city, enjoying the greenery in various parks. I also went to a pet store and bought some treats for some of the local dogs out near the temple. I then made my final visit over to the Lakshmi Temple before going back to my hotel to get ready for dinner. For my last meal of the trip, I went to one of the restaurants at the top of my list, Bukhara. This famous restaurant has been visited by many celebrities and presidents and is located in the ITC Hotel. My favorite dish was the dal makhani. The creaminess and flavors of this dish were unlike any other version that I've had before, and I also had a vegetarian platter consisting of naan, stuffed peppers, and tandoori aloo. I finished off the meal with one of my favorite desserts, rasmalai, a creamy dumpling coated in saffron-reduced flavored milk. What originally was an extension of an already short trip still felt very short for me, and it was time to head home. I headed to the Delhi airport a few hours before my flight and was able to enjoy the lounge before boarding a United 787 that would take me over to Newark in a Polaris seat that I booked. I spent the flight eating, enjoying various movies, and sleeping before arriving into Newark, where I had about an hour to enjoy and refresh in the Polaris Lounge before making my connection home to Chicago. Thanks for watching my video about my trip to Delhi and Jaipur. If you're going to India, here are some tips and considerations that you may want to take into account before traveling. The first tip is to make sure to bring a printed copy of your visa, as well as the boarding pass and any relevant hotel documents or itineraries just in case. You may not need these, but it's helpful to have it just in case you get questions. When at the airport, don't be surprised by contradictory signage or rules at airport security or immigration. For example, my bag got flagged for electronics, and when the agent tried to search through my bag, he pulled out my probiotic vitamin bottle and started lecturing me, saying I should have known better and taken that out. My next tip is with regards to ATMs. If possible, try to pull out Indian rupees from your bank in advance of the trip, as ATMs in India may have different security protocols that could cause your debit card to be rejected. Many debit cards also have a limitation of 10,000 Indian rupees per day. Next, to avoid Delhi belly, Bring probiotics or apple cider vinegar pills to keep your gut health in check. Stock up on bottled water for drinking and brushing teeth, and also bring any Imodium, Pepto-Bismol, or charcoal tablets that you may need during your trip. Finally, when hiring guides or public transportations, make sure to use sources that you trust. I've used Viator on a handful of trips and enjoyed my experiences with them, including on this trip. Hotel concierges are also very helpful in terms of getting guides and transportation around the city. Thanks again for watching this. If you enjoyed, make sure to like and subscribe, and hope to see you in the air next time.